Good evening and welcome to the, I have no idea what today is, February 7th meeting of the Elementary School Building Committee. We will go ahead and begin by reviewing the agenda, but actually before we do, I did want to note for both the committee and for those who might be watching at home, we have a few members joining remotely tonight. Given the impending weather, we also wanted to make sure that the professional staff, wasn't going to get stuck here in a longer day than they already have. So, so we will, as well as Bill Flannery is joining us remotely. So all of our votes tonight will be taken via roll call vote. Okay. So, see, we're giving him flack about not starting on time, and I don't have the agenda ready.
What's up? Back here.
Let me get a hat. That's why you get the big bucks. All right, so we have meeting minutes to review tonight. We will discuss the school committee recommendation on grade configuration. We'll have a discussion on traffic and walkers to any new school sites. we will review and discuss some new PSR stage cost estimates that were recently received. We'll take another look at the design options, and then we will return to our evaluation criteria matrix, where we'll look at the second half of the evaluation matrix and try to flush that out before next week's meeting. As always, we like to start with a public comment period, but there is no one currently in the audience for public comment, so we'll allow for the opportunity to do that later if anyone were to show up. And so the next step in our process will be looking at, actually, do we have any minutes to review tonight? I didn't see any.
I don't think there are any.
No, I don't think there are any. So
we'll skip that.
So we can skip that, and we'll go right on to discuss the school committee's well, actually, so I should double check. The people on Zoom can hear me, right? Okay, I'm getting some nods.
Yes.
So
Yes.
So we'll do a review of the school committee recommendation on grade configuration, and I don't know who would like to share an update on that, if it's Leah or Jen or Dr.
Leah,
Kavanaugh.
go ahead.
Sure.
Or Art.
So we discussed at length the pros and cons of each one of the configurations, and the school committee has voted to have a 2-3-4 school for the Elmwood replacement.
Okay, great. Any questions from the committee? Were there any expressed considerations or concerns that we should keep in mind, or as we think about building options?
Yeah, so maybe not in the larger design, but as we start talking about things like doors in and out of spaces and, cafeterias, and there was a lot of concern from teachers about ingress and exit points within the buildings, and a lot of concern from teachers about, number of students and sound in the cafeterias. So for instance, are there planning for sound dampeners, because we're talking about maybe 400 kids in a cafeteria at once. So there were several things like that. We do have a letter from them, and we can go through and try to pull out the relevant sort of design factors, so that when we get to that point, we can talk to them directly about those particular things.
That would be great.
Does this committee have a copy of that letter from the Hopkins staff?
I don't think our committee has a copy of the
Okay.
letter. I
So we
saw
should-
something that was a summary of the concerns, but yeah, that might
Oh,
be
okay.
good.
I mean, it might be helpful. I
Yeah.
think each of us kind of went through and took what we pulled out of the concerns that the folks at Hopkins had voiced, and tried to talk about what was relevant to now and what is something that's going to happen a year from now, 2 years from now, during the whole process. So some of their concerns, I think, are relevant to design and the project, the building project, but a lot of it is programming and that kind of thing too. That's those are decisions that are in the future. So but yeah, I think we can get, it's public record anyway in the
Yeah.
email, so we'll get
Yeah,
a copy for you. Yeah.
Yeah, we can
Sorry for
definitely
the
give you a copy.
delay.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a secondary question. I know that there was an abstention. I think it was connected to communication with some of the faculty members, maybe not feeling as included in decision making or whatnot. So I'm just curious, as we continue this process, are there going to be continued faculty forums and community forums where people can weigh in at design points or other pieces like that, or
We certainly,
does that happen along the way? I'm
Yeah.
just curious. I don't.
yeah, actually, as we proceed into the next phase, we intend to continue, offering those forums and even newer ways of outreach. We will get to a point where we have almost subject by subject meetings with teachers and teacher representatives, and usually as a part of that, we'll do full faculty or offer full faculty for those that can't make the individual meetings. But that'll continue, and that'll be iterative, so all the way through, even after, if it's approved at the vote, and then we continue design, we continue rounds of interviews and meetings.
And the same thing would be true from a community perspective?
Yes.
curious.
Yeah, as I recall from the last process, even as we get down to like the fits and features of the classrooms, like teachers will be able to weigh in on how many boards they want, what kind of furniture and equipment and those kinds of things that also like down to that level of detail. So I assume it'll be very similar.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, similar to just how we've approached everything, the closer we get to the building itself, the more that engagement needs to happen so that we understand the exact needs. And the schematic design phase will certainly lead the committee towards a lot of those smaller decisions that have ramifications for the project.
Okay. I think the one thing to the point that Tiffany raised that I think would be worthwhile is as we go through that process and recognizing it's over the next couple of years, let's also make sure that we're elevating that to the public in terms of awareness, because I think that there are, at times, I think the general public's understanding of the level of engagement with faculty and staff doesn't necessarily match the level of engagement that's actually going on sometimes. So I think it'll be important just to do those sort of pulse checks of even if it's not maybe super relevant for this committee, it'll be great to hear updates of all of those engagements that are happening so we can continue to get that out there.
Yeah, and I think if there is everybody's busy, it's hard to keep track of everything you need to keep track of, and I get that, but a lot of the things that were raised are things that were discussed repeatedly in meetings. So I think that, the good side of that is that they're worried about things that are already on everybody's radar anyway. Lots of things like parking, playground, like Leah said, cafeteria, accessibility, all things that have already been really a part of the discussion. So I think that's the thing. The messaging might not always be getting to the place that we want it to get to, but just continuing to trying to get it out there, because they're bringing up great points, and we knew they were great points, and they were already in the discussion. I think that kind of shows it's hard to keep track of everything. I get it,
Yeah.
So.
Was there much public feedback on the grade configuration?
There was some, not a lot.
There
but was
wasn't a
some.
lot.
Yeah.
We had a public forum to allow discussion about the configuration, and that we didn't have anyone there. We had a listening session, so
That had folks.
school committee hours, and once again, initially they weren't there for this, but then when we mentioned this was what we were there for, then they started to ask questions, so that was nice. But in terms of input and we really didn't get a lot.
Okay. Carol, do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, I think that Leah and Jen have covered it pretty nicely, and and I do think that it will be good when we get closer to the actual design phases to loop in some of the teachers who have been curious about what classrooms are going to look like or how we're going to accommodate 400 students in the cafeteria. I think those are all nice logistical questions.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay then, and I know that Perkins Eastman has already adjusted a lot of the design options that we're going to see to reflect, like we're not looking at 2-3s anymore.
No, we don't have any 2-3s.
So,
we don't have any
yeah.
2-3s.
So that'll help us kind of streamline our discussions around those as well. So, okay, well, thank you. That's a big milestone in terms of this project. I know it's a big milestone in terms of larger facility questions in the district, but for us, for our small little pocket of it here, that's a big milestone, and we're excited to just continue working on the building, knowing that now. So,
Great.
all right, now for the reason we're all really here. So we wanted to have a brief discussion on traffic and walkers, and Vinod was good enough to join us. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to again sort of frame this up from a public discussion perspective. Obviously, we've been discussing this from the very beginning. We know that really at either site, when you're talking about especially the addition of a grade, we've got traffic problems that exist in many parts of the town, and so this is going to be a critical component where we have to be able to assure the public that any decision we make and any design we choose is not going to have a really negative impact on the traffic situation. As a result, I think it's also important to note that we're rightly throwing things out of order a little bit, right? So typically in these processes, a lot of this traffic work would be done once we've selected a site. So what we've asked from our consultants is to get more information up front so that it could help inform our decision. But even as you hear that, even as members of the public hear that tonight, recognize that if this is not as thorough a detailed description of the traffic situation and the mitigation efforts as you might want to hear, it's because that's coming, right? This is a long process. We want to give it as much time as possible while continuing to answer all of those questions. So I think that I've heard from members of the public some specific questions just in passing. Well, what about a traffic signal here? What about a pocket lane here? Those are the details that will come in the design, but what we're trying to accelerate is just that idea of what do we know so far and how workable do we think these various sites are from a traffic perspective. So just wanted to kind of frame that up for where we are in the process and the discussion, and I will go ahead and turn it over to our professionals. I think it should be on.
Thank you. Again, my name is Vinod Kalikiri with VHB on the Perkins Eastman team to look at traffic and transportation for the new Elmwood School project. So just to set the stage on what we did to date, so that that can provide a little bit of background and context on where we go from here for next steps. So we initially started looking at like the feasibility of the different sites, right? I mean, there were multiple sites. We narrowed them down to, during the last few months, down to 3 sites: the existing Elmwood site, the Hayden Row site, as well as the Main Street site. That was the stage where normally during most of these types of studies that we perform during the feasibility stage, that's about where you would stop this review, saying, well, is this site feasible? Is that site feasible? You look at the numbers, you look at the roadway capacities, you look at the constraints, and then once, do some preliminary analysis and then say, yep, this is doable. And then we again get back into traffic transportation issues during design development or schematic design at a much later stage, where you get into the nuts and bolts of how long do you need to have turn lanes? And to your point, is there a need for a traffic signal here? Is it justified, or can we get away with like an actuated pedestrian crossing or something of that type? But in this instance, hearing some of the feedback over the last several weeks, we started taking a deeper dive, especially with the 2-3-4 configuration that we're going towards. I wanted to actually take a look at what happens at Hopkins and what happens at the middle school and what happens at the high school driveways. So not only are we just focusing on Marathon and the site adjacent to Marathon for this particular effort, we were actually looking at what happens along Hayden Row at each of the other driveways. And all of it in the context of making sure that we understand how the traffic flows today, what happens during the start and dismissal times for each of the schools, so that we can get an understanding of how that would change when you move the 4th grade from Hopkins to the new school, and then 6th grade from the middle school to the current Hopkins location. So that was the primary focus, and we've done that over the last couple of weeks, looking at it closer. And what I have on the graphic, in general, you see that the 1.2 mile corridor of Hayden Row, plus or minus, from Pleasant Street on Grove at that point, at the left edge of the graphic, to the traffic signal at Chestnut on the right edge of the graphic. That's about 1.2 miles. So when you look at the traffic flow on that section of corridor, and traffic studies are usually done in 1 hour increments. So even though you look at the daily traffic on roads, they have total enrollment of schools and all of that. For example, Hayden Row carries over 12,000 cars a day, vehicles a day. But that's not what we are analyzing. We are breaking it down. We break it down into 1 hour segments and we look at what happens during each of those 1 hour, and we actually pick out the peak times. So, for example, the school peaks are in the morning, the high school is earlier, elementary schools are later. So we look at those peak times. During those peak hours, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon, during the dismissal time, for example, Hayden Row carries somewhere in the order of 1,200 to 1,800 cars an hour. A lot of that are the existing schools that are using the street, but that's what is out there today during the peak times. That's a reasonably high number, and that's why you see the rolling queues and some of the backups and congestion. But when you look at what Elmwood would add to the corridor, we did traffic counts at Elmwood School. The incremental impact is a less than 10% increase in the traffic flow on the road. So we'd be adding, somewhere in the order of 175 to 200 cars over the course of an hour to that traffic flow, to the 1,800 cars that travel on the street. So as an incremental impact, it's not significant. So the 10%, it's not a significant change. It will add to the queues, right? I mean, we're not adding whole extra lanes. I mean, Hayden Row is going to remain one lane in each direction. So there isn't a solution that I would put in front of you that says this will take care of all of the problems out here. But that incremental change of moving the Elmwood traffic from where it is today to Hayden Row is not significantly impactful, because some of the traffic's already on Hayden Row today. Parents are traveling on Hayden Row to get to Elmwood. So instead of going all the way to Elmwood, they're going to be turning right into the new site at the new driveway. So again, when you take all of that into consideration, the incremental traffic is not significant. And we're talking about this during the 20-minute window in the morning and a 20-minute window in the afternoon. I was out here last week, I believe, during school hours. Outside of the 20 minutes, it's free-flowing traffic. So we're really focused on that 20 to 25 minutes in the morning and 20 to 25 minutes in the afternoon when some of the schools are starting or dismissing students. So again, the numbers are not significant that it would cause an issue. The other thing we also take into consideration is bus usage. So we do have obviously a lot of buses that are serving these schools. I understand there's an effort underway to consolidate some of the routes so that the same areas are not being served by multiple buses for different schools. So more students can be on the same bus. So that would help reduce the number of buses that would be on these roads. The other thing is the ridership. The number of students that are on these buses. I just anecdotally am hearing that there's not, they're not operating at full capacity, or probably parents and students are not making full use of the available capacity on the buses. So just as an example, if you were to take the added traffic from Elmwood, again in an hour we're talking about 150 to 200 cars, so let's say that gets added to Hayden Row. If you were to increase ridership by that number, let's say 150 more students along Hayden Row Street among all the schools, you're essentially eliminating the added traffic from Elmwood. That's the order of magnitude we're dealing with. So just by helping more students use the buses when they're able to, there are a lot of constraints why parents may not be able to get their students on the buses, schedule related or pick up, drop off, after school activities for various reasons. But 150 to 200 student increase in ridership amongst all the schools on Hayden Row is going to pretty much eliminate the added traffic of car traffic that would be associated with Elmwood, if you were to look at it from that point of view. So again, the numbers are not that significant that a small change in ridership could help offset the impact of the added traffic. The next steps on traffic analysis, obviously we'll get into the specifics of how exactly we would need to look at access and circulation. Do we need traffic signals? Are traffic signals justified? Is there a left turn pocket? For example, there's a left turn pocket in front of Marathon School today. Does that need to be lengthened? How long can we lengthen it? Are there wetland impacts associated with that if we had to widen the road to accommodate a longer left turn lane? Those are the types of design details that we would get into. And then we'll also look at, for example, when you bring the sixth graders into the existing Hopkins school, and Hopkins operates at the same time as the middle school and high school currently, there are certain circulation changes that may need to happen today. Today, the Hopkins driveway doesn't see a lot of traffic from Hopkins school when the high school and the middle school students are using that driveway to exit. But in the future, when you have additional sixth graders using that school and the hours of operation changes for Hopkins, we need to make sure that the intersection of the Hopkins driveway and the driveway coming out of the high school that feeds into the Hopkins driveway is properly designed so that there is no congestion or bottlenecks. So those are, again, finer design details, like how long you put turn lanes, what type of traffic control, the locations of the crossing guards adequate, where do we need to change crosswalk locations. There are a lot of things that we would look at, but I would say those are part of design and not intended to establish the feasibility of the project. In my mind, at least, we have gone through that process, vetted the numbers, and we've established that the Hayden Row can support that additional school, and based on the more recent review, it can support the 2, 3, 4 related changes, both at Hopkins, the middle school, as well as the new school. It's just a matter of fine-tuning and refining the specifics as part of a detailed study. But again, I wouldn't say the detailed study is not going to come back and say that this is not doable. What it would say is it would give you more specifics of how to implement the traffic plan that works for all the schools along the corridor. If you go into the next slide there. So the amount of data that we have currently, again, for the purpose of the feasibility study, was somewhat limited. We looked at each of the driveways, so those 1 through 5 circles that you see on the map represent the middle school, the high school, and the Hopkins driveway, as well as the Marathon driveway. So we looked at specific driveway locations to understand the turning movements and how that conflicts or interacts with traffic on Hayden Row. As part of the more detailed analysis, especially if you're looking for a corridor solution for Hayden Row, you'd probably need to add or supplement that data with a little bit more information. For example, Grove at Hayden Row, the signalized intersection will need to be added to the corridor. If we extend or go all the way down to Chestnut Street, we may need to include Chestnut at Hayden Row to the analysis. But we would be including some additional data collection, additional data points as part of the corridor-wide analysis. And the outcome of that, again, is a study that says these are the things that can be done along this corridor to improve safety, to improve traffic flow, and to improve traffic operations. So that would be the outcome of a study that, if we were to undertake it, that's what it would show. If you go to the next slide, Dan. Dan had asked me to kind of give some thought to what those next steps are if we were to get into that more detailed study at this stage, and what kind of a timeline we're looking at for that. So again, corridor study is to some degree part of the solutions, or what we're going to come up with is actually even unrelated to this project. It's to improve traffic flow and safety on the corridor. So we'll need to make sure that we work with town staff to make sure that the scope of the study is adequate and it meets their needs. We'll go out and collect data, prepare the study, prepare a plan, essentially a role plan showing what are all the things that can be changed along the corridor to help improve traffic and safety, have a draft report ready for review by the town, and then we would finalize it based on input we received. And that document, again, is usually something you would see as part of a later design package, but it's something that you could consider advancing now. But again, I would again remind that that's not something that would talk about feasibility. In my mind, at least, we're past that point of saying the numbers make sense. We can make these work here. It's just a matter of providing the details. So, in a nutshell, that's where we are. It's a 3+ month process if we were to get into that more detailed corridor study for Hayden Row. And I know there are other efforts underway with, I think, the bike committee, or there are other, unrelated to the school project, there are other projects that are going on. So we need to make sure that we stay coordinated so we're not developing recommendations or suggestions that contradict or conflict with other projects that are being planned in town. So there's a lot of coordination involved once you get into that corridor study. Make sure that we have some synergy between the different efforts that are going on.
So I have a question for everybody. I think that this photograph here actually shows what we would all think the study would be. So all the way back to Chestnut and all the way out to Main Street.
Yeah.
So I think he's actually capturing what the scope of the distance that we're trying to look at is with this photograph. That's basically because we want to go all the way out to Main Street. I know that there are other parties interested in us doing that. And then I think going out to Chestnut is probably the right thing.
Recipes.
So I
Well,
have a question related to that. So I agree with the area in question in terms of what we want for examination. Is the expectation that there would be recommendations that would impact schools other than the potentially new Elmwood Marathon?
I would say yes, because it would be a corridor study, and with the change in the grade reconfiguration, you're actually moving sixth graders from, the driveways. The parents would be using different driveways as they get relocated to the Hopkins Drive. So there are some circulation changes that would occur along the corridor, independent of what's happening at the new school. But overall, when we look at the study, we'll be looking at each of the driveways, and there may be a need to make certain changes at the other curb cuts to make sure that everything flows smoothly. And that's why I was saying that the study is more than what you're looking for the school itself. It's to help improve the corridor traffic.
So if you, and I just want to clarify one more thing, and then I'll open it up. So if in that instance, right, so let's say you recommend that there should be a curb cut change to the entrance at the middle school to help, and this is completely hypothetical, I have no idea what that would even look like. That's making that change likely wouldn't be within the scope of this project though, correct?
Yeah, I would think that would probably go along with the rest of the feasibility study that we're doing for the campus project. So we would take that advice into when we get into the main campus and moving sixth grade down to Hopkins, if that indeed does happen, those types of things. So.
Because I would like nothing better for than all of the traffic to be improved down Hayden Row. And again, like I said last week, this project would be a lot easier if it existed in a vacuum, but I want to make sure we're appropriately setting expectations as this body of what we can solve versus what would be data for the town, for the school district about things that could be done to mitigate the work beyond this project. I don't want people to think that like we're going to come up with some, in addition to building a school, we're going to come up with some set of solutions that can be implemented as part of this construction project that will alleviate traffic across the whole Hayden Row corridor and pay for it under the same appropriation that we're building the new school.
Yeah, I guess I kind of envision it as we'll take the recommendations that directly affect the new Elmwood School. And those is what we would implement as part of that project. And anything beyond that, it would come to the town and to the schools to decide, how we move forward with those.
Okay, so my ask in that, so do you agree with that?
I absolutely, and we do that quite often. So the way you would structure the study is you would say, for the new school, here are the recommendations. And then in addition, to help improve the overall traffic flow, here are the additional things you could consider. So you could separate them.
Yeah.
There will be some overlap because to make the school work, you may need to make some signal timing changes somewhere else. So that'll be part of the school project. But if there was a driveway that needs to be modified to improve safety and it's unrelated to the new school, that wouldn't be part of the recommendations for the new school, it'll be under the other recommendations category.
Great, and as long as those are really clearly delineated, again, I want the whole thing solved. I just don't want to set the expectation that this group can do more than we actually can. So, sorry.
That's important context, and I agree with Tim, yourself, and Vinod that there's a lot of recommendations on how to improve the broader network, but the MSBA is very clear that we can't bundle projects, and that would clearly be a town corridor solution. And so we can recommend as part of our study the benefits to that, but we wouldn't implement those that the other driveways beyond our access.
Yes, exactly. So, sorry, but other questions from the
No, I think
committee?
I think that was a good clarification, John, because I think that probably needed to be said, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the analysis would be set up so that one analysis shows what the recommendations, as you're saying, but even the analysis can be structured so they would say, here's the analysis for a 2, 3, 4 school and the recommendations that go with it. And then there's another set of analysis and recommendations that says, when this happens, grade 6 can move from point A to point B, that traffic changes. There are other things that happen because of the 2, 3, 4 configuration that may be unrelated to the school building project itself, but there will be a set of recommendations that come with that analysis.
At the risk of oversimplifying it, the way I think about it is, here are the set of recommendations that can be paid for under the appropriation this body is going to put before town meeting. Here are the set of recommendations that need to be paid for somewhere else.
I think you said that's chapter 1.
That's the distinction. That's the distinction I want to make sure we have.
We'll make sure
chapters
it's
are by
okay.
others.
Yeah.
The town's already begun that discussion
Yes.
just in the context
Yeah.
of the system-wide study.
Yeah, it's-
Because we know that the changes or the selection of the grade configuration is going to force changes at Hopkins. It's necessary, both to expand the building for the enrollment, but also to change the building for the students that will be going there. And within that, the scope of that project, there will be recommendations that come out of this study that can be passed to that design team as the Hopkins work moves forward in the future, so that they can incorporate that into the work that they're doing at that location.
Yeah, and I think the process has been really, really airtight when it comes to that. I'm just also sensitive to the fact that people are paying attention to this project at different levels. And that's where I want to make sure we can easily delineate it, so.
I can say that as a school committee member, the idea of the middle school not having 3 grades trying to go in that little loop, and instead one of those grades getting to go down the loop road, which has a lot more room for traffic, I can already see that being a huge positive.
Yeah, there'll be an improved traffic flow at the middle school, for sure. Yep.
Other questions?
I do have a question, but it might be.
No, after you.
You sure?
Yeah, of
No,
course.
I mean, this could muddy it even more, but I'm just curious if, in part of the bigger discussions that you've had, if you looked at the traffic calming work that was done maybe 5 years ago-ish, because it did incorporate the corridor, but it was specifically, I think, or one of the main reasons that sort of prompted the efforts was the traffic in front of the high school and the middle school. And I mean, I don't know if anyone would disagree with me, but I feel like those traffic calming measures were largely ineffective. So I feel like that might be something, if you, did you get a chance to look at it? If you didn't, maybe that should be something to consider too, because we did try some stuff. And I don't think that stuff made a big difference.
So, yeah, we didn't have a look back even for numbers or for geometry pre-COVID, but I do know that there were some changes that were made. And the way I see that not having maybe as big of an effect is on the speeds, for example, right? I
Okay.
mean, we collected speed data, and one of the biggest outcomes of a traffic calming project is speed reduction. But when you look at the speeds along the corridor, it's still 40 miles per hour plus. So,
Right, 40, 20, 40, 20.
right.
40,
So
20, yeah.
that's part of the issue. It's not that the solutions didn't work. You know, maybe there might need to be tweaks or adjustments, or some other things need to happen. So we'll be looking. Yeah, that'll be
part of
part
the
of
process
the
then.
larger study. A safety review would be part of that.
Okay.
Lane narrowing is one of the typical or common solutions that is considered as a traffic calming solution. That's, I believe, was what was done. But there weren't
With
some
cones.
additional measures that would be needed to go along with it. So again, yeah, that's part of the overall study that we'll be looking
Okay,
at. Yep.
right, and it's probably outside of this, like it muddies it, because it is outside of this, but it's kind of connected,
No, I think
because
it's- yeah.
if we don't choose the Elmwood site, then those cars aren't going across town anymore. If we do choose the Elmwood site, then it's really gonna impact this project, I think. All right, Tim, now that I've interrupted you, sorry.
I was just curious, when you're doing your traffic counts, do you include walkers as part of your traffic?
Yes, it's usually, yeah, it is a multimodal count. So yeah, we look at cars, pedestrians, bicyclists, buses. We look at all modes of travel.
Okay.
And we've noticed based on the data that there are not as many walkers, for example, at Marathon, but there's a reasonable amount of walking activity at the high school, middle school, which you can expect to be the case. But we actually have numbers to support that as well.
Right. Currently, there are walkers at the 4th grade, and so I think the school would revisit, or at least decide what to do about the 3rd grade, whether they stay as non-walkers or become walkers like the 4th graders that currently walk to those locations.
And for whatever it's worth, that was part of our discussion at the school committee too. Folks were concerned about walking for grades 2, 3, 4, as opposed to 4, 5, and how that might impact everything, drop off, pickup times and things like that. So it was a concern expressed. Yeah.
And just to chime in about the walking, I don't think it makes sense for 3rd graders to walk, but there might be families who live close enough to walk with kids. And that would be a nice opportunity, that if you lived close enough to walk to the school, I don't see people just sending their children necessarily, but probably on nice days, families would walk there, and that would be nice.
I do have a question. So you mentioned that on this project, we are going a little bit out of sequence with the detailed study, the traffic. So we are putting it in the front of the queue. So I just want to understand, how dependent is your analysis on the school layout, which is still being advanced and developed? Do you have to revisit your findings in the future, or?
That's a great. I was going to add a point to that. So one of the key things that would actually help make sure that the new school fits in within the overall context of this area is to make sure that there's a cross connection between the Marathon school and the new school. I know there were some scenarios where there isn't a cross connection and the new school would have its own curb cut. Again, tying that into the layout, what I would say is, from a traffic circulation point of view, having the two schools interconnected with the driveway and having the two driveways available to both schools will be the key to making sure that the traffic impact on Hayden Row is minimal. Because if you were to create a 2, 3, 4 school with its own driveway, a few hundred feet south of the Marathon driveway, you're essentially, creating another node or another bottleneck in the system. But by interconnecting the two schools and giving, parents the ability to use either driveway to enter or exit, that provides a lot of flexibility. And also, it also helps from a traffic perspective to change traffic control. There are a lot of requirements that say you got to have a certain amount of traffic before you can justify a traffic signal, for example. And if you had multiple curb cuts and people are spread across multiple driveways, the justification is diluted. But if you were to consolidate traffic, exiting traffic to one driveway, the chances of being able to justify a signal goes up a little bit. Again, those are the types of things we would look at. But from a site plan perspective, I would say that interconnection between the two schools would be key. That's something I would suggest that you don't foreclose. Even if you don't have that connection on day one, you wouldn't want to preclude that from happening in the future to maintain the flexibility.
So I think this is slightly off topic, but it's related when I'm thinking of this. It was brought to my attention again about the Upper Charles Trail Committee. We voted against the recommendation, but there's still the engineering study that went forward, and it was around Marathon and then through the lot we're thinking of using. So I think we need to make clear or at least show where we think some of the driveways will be, where we think the school will be in comparison to where they were projecting, so that we can clarify, look, this is the space we're using.
So we had some outreach from the Upper Charles Trail Committee. We've communicated with them before.
Okay.
And so meeting with them once we select a site is something that will be on the, if it's, I guess once we select a site, if it's the Hayden Row site, it's the Elmwood site, there's no
Right,
reason
there's
to meet
no
with
reason
them.
to,
But,
yeah.
but if it is the Hayden Rowe site, we'll be meeting with them to talk about the specific location we're targeting. Obviously, again, things don't exist in a vacuum. There's obviously a lot more going on with the Arbor Charles Trail Committee and the future of that trail that may, render this more or less important, but
Yeah.
yes. But yeah, that's a great call out, and that is the plan. The town engineer, who is a part of sits on the Upper Charles Trail Committee, reached out to,
Okay.
so we can make sure,
Perfect.
but yeah.
I would say a walking trail or a shared use path is a great asset to a school, as you can imagine, like, especially if you're trying to change the mode of travel, either, to have more students walk to school, having an off-road path is always a desirable feature to have. So to the extent that the site design could accommodate that would be helpful.
Okay. Other questions? From the folks on Zoom, any questions?
I think we're good, John, thank you.
Okay. I actually have a couple more. So you mentioned the initial estimates, projections have, I think you said 170-ish additional cars as a result of...
In an hour,
In an hour.
Yeah.
So,
peak hour.
so is that just sort of porting the cars that go to Elmwood over to the new school, or I want to kind of understand a little bit of...
At a conceptual level, that is what it is. So we counted how many cars go in and out of Elmwood today. So it's about, I believe it's 600 something cars trips total. But then during the peak hour, you see about 175 to 200 cars go in and out. And these are parents going in, dropping off their students and leaving, or teachers going in and then staying the rest of the day. So we don't distinguish between the vehicle types, but we do know how many cars go in, how many cars come out during that peak hour. Then for the preliminary analysis, we port that number directly to the new driveway through the roadway system. But when you get into the detailed analysis, you would essentially have additional changes where you take credit for cars that are already on Hayden Road today that are going to Elmwood, because you don't want to double count those vehicles, right? I mean, if the parents already driving north on Hayden Road to go to Elmwood, they would still be doing the same thing, so you're not double counting those cars. So we'd be making those adjustments, and if there is information on mode shift, like more students taking the bus, for example, then we would apply factors for that as well.
Would we also apply factors for, I mean, you mentioned the connectivity between Marathon and the new school if we choose the Hayden Rowe site. Would you also look at things like number of students who have, because I'm thinking there are probably a lot of parents who drop off at
siblings
Marathon
and
and then at Elmwood, and that obviously takes a car, it basically takes a whole car out of the mix, right? 'Cause it's-
That
yeah.
requires data, but yes,
How
if
can these people do this?
if the schools track that, if the school department tracks that type of data, would be able to apply that factor. That's usually a little bit of a tough calculation, but it depends on the quality of the data that you have. If you have students, a certain percentage of students that are going both to Marathon and Elmwood today, then yes, I mean, you would be able to apply that that traffic to that interconnection between the schools and not on Hayden Road.
Okay. Okay, and you said the time frame on the detailed traffic study is about 3-ish months, three months plus?
That is correct.
Okay,
yes.
and so that's basically from when we could
Release.
initiate it whenever but you can let us know like what the ideal time is to begin this work?
We're thinking the idea would be to initiate this right as we submit the PSR to MSBA to give, the maximum amount of time.
Okay.
And then have information back, with time to react fully to it during schematic design. We'll get it back and have at least a month or two to kind of think about that, mull it over, decide what's in and out of the project and how we're going to handle the recommendations.
Okay. I mean, I think the earlier the better, but I just want to make sure, like to Jagrid's question, that we're not going to have it happen so early that there are factors that haven't been determined that'll have an impact on it. So, but if you think
No, I think
that's the time frame, then I think we'll.
Yeah, once
discuss
the
early.
recommended location is selected, then they can start to look at the length of roadway and the interconnections of that. Now, the design team will still be playing with the layout of all the pieces that land around the building itself, but with the 3-month duration, there's enough time to sort through all that. You also want to make sure, we look at all the data while school is in session, so it'd be good to, wrap that up before the end of the school year. Should there be extra questions that come out of your review, we still have time to observe or comment on that with school in session.
I agree.
Hey, John,
Yeah,
I
Bill.
had a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious if maybe Ann could share her thoughts on the potential of increasing ridership to the bus. I can't imagine anybody knows the student structure there better than her, and I can appreciate some of the reasons why people wouldn't use the bus, but does Ann feel that potential is there, that the ridership could increase? Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. I think families want to put their kids on the bus. One of the challenges that we have, and we've been talking a lot about it this year, is the fact that all the students who ride the bus are essentially the same age. So we don't have role models. We don't have, slightly older students that can tell the little ones, hey, that's not what we do. Please sit on your bum. We've done a lot of teaching this year, and I do wonder if we had some 4th graders on the bus who might act as, I don't know what the word would be, but kind of, hey, little 2nd grader, that's not the expectation at Elmwood. Parents would really like their families, that's what I hear, that parents would really like their children to take the bus. But bus behavior is one deterrent, and the amount of time that kids are on the bus is another one. So if we could mitigate either of those or both, I think families might consider getting kids on their bus. The other truth is that if you're picking up at the 3 schools and you have an activity after school, you really have to, if your kid's waiting for the bus and, I think people think that if I picked up and that's quicker, then I can get to activities in the afternoon. So I don't know if bus routes are slightly, take up less time, maybe people would be more likely to put their kids on the bus. It certainly would be, the drop off and pickup is incredible. And some parents are doing it 3 times in a morning. So I think it's hard, I'm sure.
Thank you, Ann. But I would also like to, Susan, I know this is not just an Elmwood challenge, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on, I'm sure you have thoughts on how we can increase ridership, but I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Similar to what Ann said, I don't really think there's a magic bullet that will get kids on the bus. Parents make decisions for their own lifestyle, whether it's after school activities, whether, their little one, thinks it's too loud on the bus. There are a lot of different factors. So I don't think there is a magic bullet. Not having buses waste time going between schools does have a big factor, so if you're the first one to get on at the first school and have to sit there for 10-15 minutes to go pick up the kids at the next school before you even hit the road, that's a significant amount of time for a little guy to try to occupy himself.
Thank you. Any other questions at the moment on related to traffic? Well, thank you. Thanks. I know, I appreciate you coming tonight. I know that, it was a relatively quick response in terms of, I think we requested it last week, so we appreciate not only you're showing up tonight, but I know you've been doing a lot of work in the past couple weeks to do some of this assessment, which may be a little bit different than the normal project. So we appreciate you recognizing our unique need as a community and really stepping up to that. So we look forward to more.
Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I feel like the only thing we can really effectively follow up discussion of traffic with is a discussion of cost. So we're taking our medicine at the beginning of the meeting tonight. So We did receive some updated cost estimates earlier today, and I think we want to walk through what those cost estimates look. Thank you, Vanessa. What some of those cost estimates look like, and maybe have a discussion around factors that have driven some of the changes from numbers we've seen before, and kind of what the process will be going forward as it relates to cost. So I don't know if this is Dan or Jeff or.
Yeah, we'll tag team it. You want to go first or second?
So this slide just kind of gives you an overview of all the options that were looked at. It includes the 2-3s still, because these were done with that in mind. So we have all the options here right now, including the base repair has been put in, so that you can get an overview of everything. And one of the things that's actually nice about these is that they're very close. These estimates, or the two estimators, were really within, they're very, very close to each other. So it's not as though everyone's looking at the same thing and understanding the same scope, the same drawings. But we're only really interested in 2 to 4 at this point, and this is a chart that Chris and Jeff made that kind of breaks down where we're at with the 2 to 4 options right now that are still on the table.
Before we get into that, I don't know if you want to just sort of speak to the drivers of how we determined these costs a little bit, in terms of we used current space summary table to establish the building size, so that we were apples to apples in terms of what went into the building, except for the differences between the schemes and the factors that the estimators felt would fall into those. So it was really an effort to take a single standard and apply it across the schemes in a way that was reasonable between the multiple schemes, so that we could get a relative cost impact between the various schemes. And there's several factors that go into that, and we'll talk about some of those a little later on. But essentially, when you look across the bottom, the major factors that influenced the difference in cost on, let's say, the smallest 3-4 or 2-4 option was 171 million, but the largest was 176 million, except when swing space was taken into account. And so we have at most a $5 million swing between the cheapest option and the most expensive option. But amongst the Hayden Row sites, it was only about 2 to 3 million. So on a percentage basis, you're talking about 1% difference between the various schemes. So relative to the differences in the programs, it was a relatively small cost difference in the grand scheme of things when you're talking about a $170 million project.
Right, so to further explain that too, and we got to the space summary template equalization, but the estimators started on the drawings that were provided. So as you've seen, and as we talked about your last couple of meetings, there was some extra white space in the middle of those drawings. So initially, when they did their full takeoff, the buildings came out a little bit larger in different size. So we equalized that, and so certain items didn't fully catch up, but it's all within that margin of error, as Chris discussed. So that the 1% factor, shows that they're essentially equal. The Hayden Row options, there are cost drivers, which if you want to go back to the last slide, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But there are cost drivers with the east versus west, at Hayden Row. So if you are further into the site, some of the differences are that you have to clear trees further back. You have to bring your roadway paving back, you bring your utilities back. So the longer the roadway, there are some additional cost premiums. And so that was, potentially in $1 million, $1.2 million range to work to the back end of the site versus the front end of the site. Did we cover the wetlands yet?
No.
Okay. I was listening on the ride in, but I missed the first 2 minutes, so I appreciated the Zoom link for the ride in. We'll get to the wetlands in a second, but Easton, the Pinwheel versus the Village, the longer wings versus the 3 shorter wings versus the 2 longer wings. They're very similar. There's one extra end wing, right? With a 3-wing versus a 2-wing, you have that extra end of the bar. So there is a little bit additional circumference of that exterior skin. There's also potential with extra stairs that are decisions that will still need to be made amongst the committee. As the design team works and pushes and pulls the design, you'll locate finally the stairs and egress points and how the either 2 wings or 3 wings work out. So the point of all that is there's a lot of things that can still be worked out within the design, no matter which option that you put in. Some of those will all equalize. But the one that wouldn't would certainly be east versus west. That has a fixed cost for being deeper in the site overall. And then we pulled it back to where we were currently. And so Bob and Dan can talk about the changes from the PDP to PSR in terms of square footage. But one of the biggest drivers on the jump from PDP to now, which is not an insignificant jump, is the size of the building. So the size of the building as it looks today in the development stage is up 7,000 square feet from where it was, 3 months ago at the very beginning. And you recall at that point, we were still developing the ed plan. We were still having the user meetings. So some of those conversations have continued. As Tiffany asked earlier, we never stopped meeting with the users and the teachers. Those conversations are continuing to evolve. And so, Bob, I don't know if you want to hit on a couple of the highlights that have changed.
Sure. So when we started the original test fits, we had an early cut of the program. It's expected that as we approached and ultimately submitted the PDP, some of the program was refined. In this next phase, we expect as conversations continue, the program will tweak again. And some of it is tabled decisions. So for example, we have the family resource room still in the program. It's still under debate if it remains or what size it is. We know that there's some MSBA standards that don't translate directly to Hopkinton, but then there's some Hopkinton standards that aren't in the MSBA. So we've been trying to marry some of those. And that specific example I'm talking around in a circle is STE space versus health and wellness spaces. So there are some things there that we're comfortable with at this moment, but we'll have additional conversations on. You all know that we've talked about the number of lunch seatings, and although the MSBA will allow fewer seatings, as few as 2, it's not the desire of the school to have lunches that large. So those types of things also affect square footage. Probably the significant change, the 7,000, I believe that's gross square feet.
Correct.
I think we're more in the neighborhood of 4,000 net, came out of MSBA prompt and discussions about special education space. And of all the subject matter where we build a program for a school, that's the one that really is custom built. Many other spaces can be calculated, the size of the class, the frequency to which related arts are taken. So the special education one is one that always moves around, and I suspect that when we have more detailed discussions, it may tweak and evolve again. Special education needs are also always evolving. So that represents the bulk of the change that we see here in the increase.
Can I ask a question about the options? Can we downgrade an option already? Can we say no to any option, or do we have to keep them all until we make a vote on a particular site? Because the reason I'm saying is that 20 million right there, considering the entirety of the campus changes that we're making to the school district and the amount of money that we're asking the town, everything else is within 1 or 2 million. That 20 million there's no reason for it. We can't justify it.
It's actually a bigger problem than that. It's $20 million, and we don't have any idea
And
where it
there's
would go.
actually no swing space.
So it's 20 million theoretical dollars. Like,
Right.
it doesn't even, so yeah, I think the answer to your question, and this is where I'll look for Bob and Dan and Jeff and Chris to keep me honest, is as a committee, we could right now say, we could vote and say, that's unreasonable, we don't want to consider that anymore. I think the approach we've been trying to take is kind of leaving them all on the matrix so that we have a really good kind of consolidated view of what all of them look for. But certainly if that's something that the committee wants to do, it's kind of, we have to get to a recommendation. We're using a process, but there's no prescribed process for how we have to do it.
If there was any reason why, for some reason, we could say there's a definite positive impact to that site, and so maybe we can consider the difference in cost and say that it'll give us something, I would agree, but all the rest of them are just as good. And, like I said, we're going to be asking for a lot of money from taxpayers for a lot of different things in the coming years. It just seems like there's no good reason to have that particular one follow us through.
So as a single member of the committee, I completely agree with you. From a process
Yeah.
perspective, so thinking
That's
about
why
it
I
as
was
chair is, well, we can do whatever we want, but what I'd also offer is, we're not that far from getting a 1.
Okay.
So I think at this point, sort of going through the process of cutting that out, certainly, unless people feel differently, we shouldn't spend a lot of time talking about that one tonight because of the additional piece. But I think sort of going through the mechanics of cutting it off and cutting it off of the assessment criteria when we're voting next week on the 1 feels like it's not worth it for.
We did plan to discuss swing space tonight, and I can give you the preview version, which is the bullets are very convincing in terms of which direction you want to go. But I would suggest that we table that till later in the discussion when we get to the matrix, because I have a feeling when we talk about that, it'll be quite clear as to which direction to head as it relates to swing space.
But in terms of process, to answer your question, when you for the next meeting, which is where you're really envisioning the whittling down, many committees do take a different approach. They, get consensus and vote the option, and everybody moves forward. Others start to vote off the ones that are less desirable, and you get down to the bottom 2, and then you really, debate the differences, between those 2 or 3. And so there are multiple ways to get from the list of 7 or 8 that we have, down to the 1 or 2 that you may want to dig deeper on, and the nuances between those.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I'll say this, announce that my wife swore me to silence tonight. But are all these options and all these numbers considering a zero net energy concept?
Yeah, these have all the wells in them and everything.
So they all assume that that's net zero achievable.
Yes.
What's not in any of these is the photovoltaics to actually deliver the net zero.
Yeah.
So this makes the building thermally efficient. This gives you the full geothermal system. There's costs.
Okay.
to
I understand
decisions
you
to be
gotta run
made
the
that
motors
you can.
to pump the liquid. I understand all that. We're gonna get that by solar somehow free. I don't know. But I just wanted to make sure it was clear that that's the
No, it's a-
direction we were
it's a-
going.
it's a very good
That
point.
was the number that was reflected here.
We've taken the approach that you're not paying for the photovoltaics as part of this project.
Okay.
That's feedback we should get from you guys versus taking that approach. On Marathon, you did just a small array on the roof, and you then came back and actually flooded the roof to get really what you needed to get closer to the lower utility usage. So to get true net zero, you may need some parking lot canopies. We're still in the process of determining what the EUI is for the building.
Lost the connection to the Zoom. We're trying to get back on to mute that. Yep.
You can just ask them, right?
Yeah.
If your iPhone
Thank you.
4. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, iPhone 4.
Okay. Other.
Going back to whether we should keep that Elmwood option with the 190 million, I was just thinking from a process standpoint, if we don't see that option, if we remove that, it would seem like from a cost standpoint, Elmwood and Hayden Row are about the same. If you didn't see that one option with the high number, so
Yeah, and
just
I
from
think
that perspective, I think it's better to keep it.
that's a good
My
point.
opinion.
That's a good point. Because in all honesty, like even thinking about the Elmwood Bar, right? I mean, you could physically do that one without swing space, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. Like I think we've talked about the idea of kids going to school on that site for 2+ years while the construction is happening. So
Yeah.
swing space, you could actually put swing space probably under the Elmwood Bar option too as a possible cost, because if we went that way, we might want to pursue. So you're right. It kind of gives a false impression of Elmwood. I think it's a great point.
We had actually talked to that, and we actually should have carried some number, I think, for that, because of the reason of the simple example of if you were to do the geothermal there and you would do the bar building, the only place to build the geothermal would be under the ball field, which is also going to be your outside recess space, your temporary parking, in your laydown area. So while you construct that field, you have to relocate all those facilities somewhere else. So that may be off-site parking for teachers and shuttling them over. That may be a remote parking lot for contractors and shuttling them over. So there is a swing space element, nowhere near the 20 million, of the replicating the modular value, but a 7-figure number, no doubt by the time you add all these things and the durations that they would take up on site.
Or you extend the durations and you don't have something that you necessarily call swing space, but you have additional general conditions or other factors that extend your construction duration that also aren't reflected in the Elmwood.
But I think we should clean that up for the record for the viewers at home, and it's partly why we've shown the grayed out ad reno too, because that also had swing space associated with it too in the code repair. We'll need to carry those anyway to the MSBA, but it's good to for the record for the people that come behind us
I agree.
understand.
Like, once again, the town is really concerned about budgets and about the amount of money we're spending on all of this. So a realistic view of what it means to stay on the site would be good. I think the matrix also does a really good job with it, or all the other non-cost factors that we need to look at. But yeah, cost is definitely a primary concern right now.
Jeff, you bring up a good point that we probably should have clarified as it relates to this list and the school committee decision on the 2-4. So as a reminder for people, mostly for people watching at home, because I know that I think the committee is well versed on this, we are required to carry this work on an addition renovation option or just a code-based repair on the existing building in our next submission to the MSBA. So while they're grayed out, we can't actually remove them, but fundamentally neither of those options accommodates a 2-4 school. So effectively, if we are to follow the school committee's directive of picking a building that is a 2-4 school, those are not viable options. But from a process perspective, for the MSBA, we're required to continue to carry them. So that's why people might be confused as to why they see those there when it says 2-3, and it seems like we already talked about that, but that's why.
Yeah, that was part of my process question too, because I knew those two had to be carried.
Yeah. Other questions on cost?
So we'll, we put the 30% multiplier for today. I'm going to take another look at that for next week's meeting, so that 30% may be dialed in a little more. We'll take another look at cost. We got the numbers just last night. Literally, it was 5 o'clock. We were reconciling all the final numbers, so we wanted to make sure they're there. So we're going to take another look, and we may clean up a few of these numbers before we come back in front of you next Monday. So you may see some shifts there, and I may dial in that 30% a little more project specific as it relates to some of those things that are a driver on one site versus the other, or one option versus another, if there are costs associated with that.
And related to Mike's point about are these net zero, is net zero, I mean, these cost estimates are obviously cost estimates on the conceptual designs as they are right now.
Yeah.
We're going to go through a very detailed design process as a committee where we're going to be asked to make a lot of decisions about the design of this building that will impact those numbers. So, as we look at them, there's a lot of work to do within what's driving those costs of decisions we make that may discount them in some cases, so just so people are clear on that. But we do appreciate it. I know how late that you all got this data, but I think it was really helpful and important for us to have it tonight. So I really do appreciate the work that went into getting that, get that put together so quickly.
Yep, no, we appreciate it. We had added this meeting because we thought it was good to bring that data in, give you a couple of meetings to talk about, the order of magnitude cost as we dial it in and look at it. The other thing I want to note about cost is in the backup, you'll see that there's a significant difference between construction manager at risk versus a general contractor, which is design, bid, build. We've talked about that earlier in the process. You'll need to make that final decision down the road. Which site you pick may have an impact on that. If you're at the Elmwood site, certainly the construction manager will be the preferred method because you are working on an active campus with very tight logistics. You may need early packages to work around that. If you choose the Hayden Row site, that's more of an open conversation with pros and cons, and we'll debate that. Depending on which site you pick, you may choose a different path with design, bid, build versus general contractor. But for right now, they're all CM at risk. and you'll need to make that decision before we get to the July kind of timeframe for the next estimate.
Thanks. All right, so that's it for cost. So we'll look at review and discuss updated design options.
So first one is that we had the wetland scientist out to the site, and she has discovered the primary objective was to look at that one that was up by the marathon to make sure that the outline of that had stayed relatively the same, and it has. That's good news. However, there are two that have appeared now. One is close to the 147 property. It's off the back of someone's property. It's a small diamond shape. You can see that little diamond shaped blue, but that creates those two buffer zones. So it's actually creates a much larger footprint from that little wetland. And then there's another one between the brewery property that actually straddles the line, mostly on their property and a little bit on yours. And now that buffer zone is now popped into the site as well. She was out again today to finish the work and has told me that there were a couple more, but they're up north of the by the marathon on the northern end in the back of the property, so that she doesn't feel that those will impact our development. So that's good news that there's no more of them that are in the way. These ones, we think we can work the building out of the buffer zones if we so choose to use that side of the site, as that's the selected area. And we can definitely get the roads into the 100-foot zones. Try to work our way around and minimize the impact on these two areas that have appeared on the property.
So the roadway would have a culvert, essentially a hydraulic connection from one side to the other of the existing wetlands.
Which we discussed earlier today, which we did at Marathon.
Yeah.
Right, so it's something that is typically done for these.
Yeah, and we did have this information when we went into the cost estimates, so we did push some funds into those estimates to deal with this.
Great.
In
They
this scenario,
didn't
is
find
there
any-
anything on the east side that would affect?
No, they're way up at the top. She said they're small and they're up at the top northwestern side of the property up by the marathon edge there. So if anything, you might need to shift the connector roads around, but we haven't really put those in. Those aren't set in stone in any means. So
Just to further that conversation, so you're allowed, to fill a certain amount of wetlands if you replicate it, which you've done previously on the marathon and other projects in town. There is a threshold of 5,000 square feet. Beyond that, you then start to trigger Army Corps of Engineer and other, federal level permits. So that's an item we'll keep an eye on. So as Dan noted, they'll pull the building away from it. We'll have to deal with it with the roadway crossings, and we'll be cognizant of, that threshold to try and minimize the permanent complexities on the site.
So this negatively affects east designs, right? On the Hayden Rail property.
Go back to
it's going to affect both because those two wetlands are going right across the secondary road connection out to Hayden Road that we absolutely must have. So it affects them both. If you put the building back in the back part of the site, you still have to build the
You have to
road
cross
that exits at the 147.
Right, but I was thinking more about the larger campus set up on the east.
Yeah,
It may slide up and to the right a little bit. So I think, one of the other things that through design, you can even look at this image here, right? The athletic PE field is shown as a big rectangle. It's not magic. It doesn't have to be an exact size. It's meant for physical education and not for a varsity level field. Now, you guys can choose that. It's still a decision you guys can make. But if it doesn't need to be a varsity level field, it can take on a different shape, or one pocket of those four can end up in a different location. You can easily juggle those pieces around the building. Same with the teacher parking. It doesn't have to be the large square box. It could be dispersed around the site, like some of the other options showed the teacher parking, I think including this one, kind of around the ring road, around the back. So there's ways to tuck things around the site that still allow you to get both east and west options.
And Perkins did some back of the napkin sketches to validate that it was possible, but we didn't want to confuse the discussion tonight by introducing a new design at the 11th hour.
Okay, thank you very much.
So it's not negative in the sense that it makes any particular option less workable. It just has workable differently. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I don't think the second and third and fourth graders need varsity level fields.
So these next two slides really might want to come at some point as we're going through the evaluation matrix, because they dive into the educational program piece. You want me to dive into it now, or?
Yeah, no, I think we're going to segue that.
Okay.
If there's anything else on the agenda in front of us.
I think that's all we had, is covering what we wanted, or the evaluation criteria that we're talking about tonight, and then an open discussion of how that criteria affects the building. If we want to jump into that.
Yeah, the first one was educational programs, so we asked Bob to come up with some concepts to help stimulate the conversation.
Yeah, so because we're at a feasibility level, you can't necessarily see everything that's been written into the educational program. So we took some highlights from visioning. This is a slide we've presented before to maybe highlight what might you start to see at this level. And things like scale, you might recognize, you might start to evaluate, well, 2 longer wings versus 3 shorter wings. That somewhat speaks to scale. It doesn't mean either one wouldn't work and isn't a scaled environment, but things like the transparency and visibility, you might say, well, how does that show up in a plan? And it's really the space in between. So if we look at a floor plan and we see there are openings to views outside, connect to outdoor learning, these are the things that you can see at the planning level. And it goes on. Some things like sustainability, you can't see everything. A lot of it is just how you build the envelope of the building, but good orientation is a fundamental that you would want to see at the planning level. So these are some of the things that you can see, and what we did on the next slide is show all 4 of the plans. 2 of them have siting alternatives, whether it's east or west, but we showed all 4 of the plans, and we started to highlight what are some of the considerations, the differences. And what you can see in the top bar, so we go from the left, which is the bar plan on the Elmwood site, also known as EE4, then the village plan on the Elmwood site, that's the one that has the additional 20 million and requires the relocation. And then we have the pinwheel, and that can be located either on the east or the west portion, but the plan is the same. And likewise with the village, we have that located on the east or the west at the Hayden Row site. So as I had already started to allude to, the 2 longer wings mean 9 to 10 classrooms in each wing. That means 200 plus students, where if in some of the village or the pinwheel options you see shorter wings, so you're now talking 6 or 7 classrooms and 130 students. So I'm not saying either one of them isn't workable, but it's a consideration. So that's repeated. I put in green if it were maybe more favorable. That's my initial take on this. But again, it's really up to the committee to assess or bring their opinion into the conversation. The other thing we noticed is that when we have the 2 wings, we're always reserving the space to add on to them. But if it's only 2 wings, that gives you times 3 stories, that gives you 6 additional classrooms that you can add on. If we have 3 wings, you can add as many as 9 classrooms. So there's a little bit more flexibility there. It's very subjective, but on some of the plans, starting with the far left, there's the suggestion of a courtyard. When it's surrounded by the building and maybe has one open end, it makes it very protected. An additional fence or gate is very simple to make it a kind of contained outdoor learning space as part of the school. So a consideration might be, in the first option, we see 1 small courtyard area. In the 3-wing plan, you see that there are 2. In the pinwheel plan, we're back down to 1. And in the village, you have 1, but it's significantly larger. The other thing I think that might be more significant is the location of the gym and caf. In some cases, they're coupled together. And that's a great opportunity because you can have a stage in between the gym and the caf that opens to either side for very large full assembly or some form of performance. But that also means that you've consolidated a lot of the traffic. And what we've heard certainly from the Marathon School is is in that particular plan with everything funneled down the same corridor, it's a challenge. So that would be something to consider. In some of the plans, you can see here, in the Pinwheel in the Village on the Hayden Row site, we actually have the gym and caf spread a little bit further, so that provides maybe some relief. The stage might not be between the gym and the caf, but now the stage could possibly open to the outside. So maybe that's just a trade-off of sorts. And I think, happy to hear more thoughts or anybody that would scour, but these are the only considerations that we think you can kind of see or evaluate at this level with these plans, because the designs aren't done. Any one of these plans will still go through some tweaks, media center or music room locations can modify, but the bones for each one of these maybe set the stage for a few considerations.
So one of the reasons we wanted to highlight this for the committee is that we have two decisions to make next Monday. Decision number one, it was, of course, which site you want to pursue, but decision number two is which design do you want to take to the next level. And so this gives you an opportunity to highlight some of the differences. It's probably less subjective in this format than the format that we used for the matrix itself in terms of the recommendation that we gave you. But it allows you to begin to think about how choosing a different scheme changes the nature of the building and offers you different opportunities as you move forward into what will develop into the ultimate scheme that the town proposes.
Okay. Any questions?
I love the idea of a stage that opens up outside like that. That just, in terms of indoor outdoor, right? That's fun. One question I have is, what are the differences in sort of the ADA type difficulties with each one of or are they pretty much neutral?
They're pretty much neutral. These aren't detailed enough to finalize where elevator or stairwell is, but in each one of them, the school, every floor, every level of the school is completely accessible. There wouldn't be a difference. In a universal design, what you would do is make sure that the approach or the access for everyone is the same or celebrated in the same way, so an elevator wouldn't be hidden around a corner. It would be part of, maybe even a feature, in the lobby, just like a main stair would be.
This slide's really helpful, actually, to sort of see, because pretty much these options are available with maybe one exception. Elmwood's current site might have an exception, but they're available on anywhere we build, basically these 4 choices. Yeah, this is really helpful.
Does the bar plan still have a north-south orientation on the classrooms?
You'll see when we get into some of the other criteria, it is not ideal orientation. In all of these images, I made north straight up, so you can see the twist on that plan.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Makes it less than ideal, and in the evaluation matrix, you'll see it's down a notch from a sustainability point of view and educational point of view.
Okay.
We weren't going to march through these, but we included all the plans if we needed to reference them.
I have a feeling we'll be jumping back and forth between them as we go through the various
Last week is any indication.
So to sort of begin the discussion about the various evaluation criteria we're talking about tonight. Last week we talked about traffic, parking, permitting, school growth, district operations, public safety considerations, site complexities, walkability, and public utilities. And so any members of the community who missed last week's meeting could look at your discussion last week to understand the discussion that went into those. Today we're really focused on 1 through 8 in this list, which we just talked a little bit about the educational program and how the different schemes could accommodate that in different ways. We'll be talking about cost and how they are relative. We touched on that already. We'll be talking about schedule duration and the effect that the different schemes have on the overall schedule, disruption to education caused by construction, including fields, which is an important part of the outdoor component of education, as well as the sustainability, which is really the opportunities that the sites and the schemes provide for sustainability within the building, versus net zero achievable. And that's really whether there's an impediment to net zero that's present in one scheme versus another. Finally, we'll talk about construction impact to neighbors and what I feel will be a very short discussion about swing space.
Chris, I want to make one slight adjustment. We did say last week that we would open up the opportunity to revisit the matrix on traffic, given the information we just heard from Vinod. So let's just make sure there may not be a change, but let's just make sure we give the committee the opportunity there.
Okay. So we provided the committee with the draft matrix that you see on the screen here, just to talk through some of the decisions that went into the educational program accommodation. We talked about how obviously the base repair and the ad reno, we could talk about that with each of the elements, but obviously as 2-3 schools, they would not be considered moving forward based on the school committee's vote. In this case, obviously the base repair doesn't allow you to accomplish your current educational program, and the ad reno as a 2-3 would not allow you to build a 2-4 school, so that obviously knocked it down the list. Also wouldn't allow you to accommodate it as freely as you would in a new construction school.
Right, so even with the 2-3, it was already less advantageous because you were dealing with existing smaller rooms, poor orientation, and lack of adjacencies desired by the ed program. So all the other new construction options, at a minimum, advantageous. One of the reasons why I think the 3-classroom pod, bumped up, it was a shorter walk as opposed to the longer bar durations with the village scheme. And as Bob noted, additions at the end of that would only lengthen the end of that walk, should that be an issue. But any of the new construction options are all very good options, have great adjacencies. There are some trade-offs Bob showed you on the prior slide about the combination or separation of the gym and CAF and how you feel about those spaces. Some of the other shared communal uses have landed on different floor plans, art and music and STEM and media center, sometimes with some double height space, and some of those things are interchangeable.
Are we going line by line?
No, we'll just keep
Well,
going.
yeah,
If there are any questions on program, Bob
Okay.
Bob colored it in his last couple slides, but if you want
So-
more insight.
So continuing with cost.
Yep.
Obviously the base repair is the cheapest option.
Sorry, Chris, can I hold you up there? So we talked on a couple slides ago about the base repair and ad reno basically being carry forwards that aren't going to reasonably be under consideration. Does anybody have any objection if we just don't talk about those in this? So
Perfectly happy to start on number 3.
Let's get to the ones we can choose from.
So, starting with the bar, from a cost perspective, we viewed the bar and the Hayden Rose schemes as largely equal on cost. I think there's a $5 million at most variation, and we didn't see that as, given the selection criteria, we didn't see that as something that couldn't be overcome in that scheme versus the other schemes from an order of magnitude basis. There is some savings associated, as you saw earlier, from pursuing the bar scheme versus the other schemes, but there's other costs involved that likely make up for that, making them relatively equal, so that we colored all of them as sort of an equal neutral. We did note that the swing space does push you into a less advantageous, and one could say it's a I forget, what is it, disadvantageous or least advantageous. And you could make the argument that with the swing space, you could color the Elmwood Village scheme as red. But in that case, that's up to the committee to consider. But we didn't see anything that clearly differentiated one scheme from another based on cost once we got the estimates back in.
Yeah, I think red for Village makes a lot of sense, and that also, since I know we haven't talked about it yet, but since the swing space is red for the other one, even though we're calling it yellow, we didn't get any cost for swing space for it. I would assume that turns it orange, right? So we'd end up with a red for the village, and then probably an orange for the bar plan when we start to take into account swing space costs, which we didn't have this time.
Yeah, we need to look at and dial in. We will take a harder look at the swing space associated with Elmwood. You know, right now of the options, that's a little lower than the 2 at Hayden Row or the 4 at Hayden Row. However, you know, the CM versus design bid build conversation does come into play, because you know you're likely not going to do a design bid build at Elmwood where you have the option open at Hayden Row. We didn't color that because I wanted to kind of bring that here. It's really a conversation that you could pick now, or you could wait as you dial in the options and make the decisions as you collect more information on traffic and site and wetlands. You know, you leave that option open should you choose to do it at a later date. But there are some real savings on the table for that discussion. And you know, the east being deeper on the site, there is a premium there of $1.5 million or so. You know, we could change the coloring of the Hayden Row to make one a light green versus a neutral. You know, is another comment we can talk about related to that.
What is, so on that one, when it says cost above baseline, what is baseline?
Baseline would be, you know, essentially your cheapest option, right? So we were trying to, you know, for the purpose of everybody viewing at home that says paying $170 million for a project is red, no matter what you say.
Right.
We were trying to do it on a relative, so we were trying to discount there's the base, no matter what you do is going to cost you X, and above baseline, you then start to separate the strata of how these rank out. So we can, whether we do it tonight or the next meeting when we take another look at the swing space and a few of those other ones, you may dial in the nuances, and that may help you get to your final decision of the options as you go through it.
So I'll throw out there, I agree with Leah that I think $20 million is a really big number. So I would think the Elmwood Village should be red.
I agree as
I
well.
agree, yeah.
In terms of the bar, Jeff, I want to clarify what I think you were saying, which is that these are all done CM. All the costs are done CM right now. So, and the bar comes in a little bit less expensive than the Hayden Row options, which means even if we added in the potential swing space cost, that might be even with the other Hayden Row?
That's correct.
Okay, so from a cost perspective, I think if that's the case, then yellow makes sense, because where we are right now, we're not differentiating between CM or design bid build. So I think it gets sort of apples to apples across from a construction. So I think from my vantage point, I would say keep it yellow, make the other one red, and
That
we're
makes
good.
sense.
And that, other than the red, that was largely the logic, that there was push and pull to each of these, and that they netted out relatively the same.
Could we revisit that one next week if we
You can-
do have more swing space information?
You can revisit everything on the list. I mean, it's your list, right? I mean, this is meant as a tool to help you have the dialogue, to stimulate the conversation, and for those that follow on after us to understand, you know, how you guys related to it. At the end of the day, you may make it very different, right? If you're down to, if you vote the rest of them off and you're down to the 2, you're then more finely slicing the bread to understand exactly how you want to differentiate the options. So yes, you can revisit anything. This is all an open discussion.
But I would say you're not going to carve out $20 million.
No, that's
So-
right.
No.
Yeah. But the 5 yellows may find another way to be orange or, you know, or light green or. All right, so scheduled duration, so another one that changed a little bit related to cost, so I just want to note that, you know, one of the other cost drivers is we made them a little longer. We conceptually said 2 years for the new builds, I think in PDP, and now we're saying 28 months. We build in a little more buffer, market conditions, you know, not knowing the finality of the site specifics. You know, we're going to tighten that up when we get to schematic design in terms of the actual duration. The Elmwood sites had longer ones because you're demolishing the building, so that alone is adding a 6-month phase. You have an enabling work in the case of swing space, and in the case of the Ad Reno, which we're not talking about, it's a much longer as you move your way around the existing building. So all the all the Elmwood options scored lower from a schedule duration standpoint. Disruptions to education during construction. Again, the Elmwood campus and the bar you were building, directly adjacent to the building. In some cases, very close to the gymnasium. How the school handles pickup and drop off would need to be solved. Where parking and recess and all that happens. So that certainly has a large impact. And, currently we graded out that one and the other Elmwood as orange. Cases can be made to make both of these red, but as a starting point, we wanted to start there. In the case of the village, the disruption to education is they're all out of the building, and you have a modular school in a place to be determined for free when you get there, because we didn't carry a cost of what to buy in terms of a location to put them. But they would have to go somewhere else. This is the logistics, the busing operation of where that somewhere else is. Again, so either one of these could be deemed red by your vantage point, but we wanted to start the conversation with, obviously, the ad reno and the code are pure red because you're occupied renovating. And so we graded these a little higher as orange.
Just one minor correction. On the consideration, it says HR West schedule is a little longer, but I think you mean east based on the coloration.
I do mean east.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a typo.
Okay.
Could you
I was
like
a little
It's a
confused.
typo that I will find right now.
the comments on the right? Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, so the difference on schedule on east versus west was that, again, that extra time to go deeper into the site, more utilities, more road. That was what the delta was there.
Yeah, that made sense, like I said, but I was trying to read the stuff and I was like, wait.
No, we debated, internally whether the Hayden Row East might be a light green versus a dark green as it relates to disruptions to education. But because it has its own dedicated driveway, on 147 Hayden Row, you could separate construction traffic. It's a separate fence. We felt that was not a significant impact to change the grading of an east versus a west. But, again, certainly just a talking point that we wanted to, put out there as to why we arrived at those being, dark green, because they have their own isolated zone and don't commingle currently at this point with the parent traffic as it's envisioned today.
You don't think there's a disruption with what we found with the wetlands coming in to build even a temporary road going in through? Because you got a demo 147, right? Then you got the wetlands going in through that space. Mm-hmm. Does that factor into?
You're very perceptive, Tim. Yeah. we did not have that information when we colored it, so we did not account for that. But that is an excellent point to raise, that there will be a certain portion of the phase for either option at Hayden Row, and maybe that knocks them all to a light green as opposed to a dark green, because we will be sharing driveway access until such time as we can establish a roadway.
Well, if you think they need to be like green, great, but I do think those two orange, the bar and the village at Elmwood, I think they're red. I think picking up an entire school of children and moving it someplace else would be a pretty big disruption to education. So I would be very in favor of turning that red. And even building the new existing right next door.
Yeah, I was thinking at the minimum, the bar plan should be red, because that shows like the construction fence. That's the one that's like right up against.
Yeah, exactly.
And that, like, when we were talking earlier tonight, even talking about like the laydown of where the construction materials would go is where the teacher parking would be. So at some point, like it would all cross over.
Shuttling teachers would not be popular.
No.
I mean, like, that's a hard
Could you
no.
imagine
Yeah,
teachers?
exactly.
Oh my gosh, it's a
Not
nightmare.
for anyone. So yeah, I think those would both be red.
It's the carrot for the new building.
Listen, yeah,
Drive
right.
a little bit
Nope.
further.
Yeah, that is not going to
I'm
go
sorry,
over.
you can't get there
Right.
earlier for your planning that you want to do before school.
Exactly.
The shuttle's not running yet.
Nope. So yeah, I
think
just,
that would be red.
Yeah.
For disruption, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's both the Elmwood ones, the bar and the village, for both separate but important reasons.
Well, and then my question was going to be, if we're talking about sharing the driveway to Marathon, you were saying light green, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
So the whole row.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's still advantageous, but
Yeah.
light green advantageous. Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys are fast.
Sorry.
Poor Chris is taking minutes and updating the matrix real time.
multitasking.
I had to do last week when he wasn't here.
I think while Chris is
Totally
catching
fair.
up, Lee, I think it can stay light green because we can schedule those times and off pickup, drop off times, right?
It's not happening.
And the road is far enough away from the school where even if there's increased traffic going up, I don't think it's gonna disrupt, learning. You know, it's not right next to the building, so I think it's, you know, I'm sure Mr. Bowe would like not to have trucks going up and down, but I think she would
Kindergartners love trucks.
accommodate.
That road
Us
was
as well.
initially designed to be as wide as it is for something like this.
Yeah.
We had no idea what was gonna go on the rest of the site. That's why that road's so wide. So I suspect it's a non-issue.
And there is mitigation that can be done with scheduling and making sure that trucks arrive outside of drop-off and pickup hours, and just site logistics that can be adjusted as times go on. So part of the discussion that went into this is it achievable? Because you could probably find one point that would knock every scheme, but is that point enough that it's, when viewed relatively one scheme to the next, is it significantly different? And I can certainly understand how the disruption to education for the Elmwood sites, given how compressed you are, even with swing space, that certainly strikes me as significantly different, but it's not so much to say that sharing a driveway for a period of time that could be summer when the school's closed is enough to push the Hayden Row sites to being yellow, for instance.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody's talking, yeah, I think we're,
Just as a-
light green,
as a talking point.
light green at worst is what we're talking about for those, yep.
Yeah.
As a shameless plug, so it's also an opportunity to teach the kids, no matter which school, whether it's at Marathon or at Elmwood, about the education of construction. We tend to work that into the program itself. We did that at the center school, where we actually, myself and all the contractor architect, we all went over there and taught the kids about the building materials and had a little session with them in the gymnasium. And we try to do that and make that an opportunity we offer all the towns we work into. And the shameless plug part is the MSBA is actually showcasing some of my projects tomorrow at their roundtable, and it includes some photos from the Hayden, from the Marathon School as to how Compass and Vertex reach out to the students in town. So we offer that again.
Very nice.
And the kids had a blast. They had a blast doing that with those guys. Did you
Yeah,
know that?
they all got plastic hard hats. They did.
Yeah, and so the MSBA is catching on to that, and the Associated General Contractors is making the presentation, trying to help stimulate growth in the market for them. So they obviously want to get kids excited about it early and find ways to bring the education and construction back to the schools that we're working on. Anyway, I digress, but
That wasn't even a grass. That's legit.
We'll still call it a shameless plug.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It can be both.
That is very cool.
okay. So that was disruption to education. Maybe we'll skip over the next two and go to disruptions to impacts to neighbors while we're on that topic, and then we'll go back to sustainability. So kind of down two pegs. We talked about the impact to neighbors, and so they're both interesting sites in the sense that they're wooded on two sides or more. They're accessed from one to two sides of the street. So, this was a more complex one about impacts to neighbors, right? In a more densely populated area, kind of draw the perfect circle around it. Elmwood has the more dense development to one side of it, but otherwise only has two houses. So where do you kind of define impacts to neighbors on that? And similarly at Hayden Row, you have the kind of 3 or 4 abutters kind of facing on Hayden Row, but otherwise, it's pretty wide open. So, this is a one that was, more interesting than others and more free-flowing in terms of discussion. They both were on arterial commuter routes, meaning, as we talked about earlier tonight, the thorough traffic that goes down Hayden Row and Wood Street to Elm Street. And so that was kind of neutral between the two as well. And so the other reason why we made Elmwood orange versus the other ones, which were yellow and light green, was the blasting aspect. You would have to provide and pay for a survey, which is not big money, but to the abutters over there, to photo document all their existing properties. So there's a process related to that. And then obviously checking in and following up with them. Blasting, as we talked about at the last meeting, is not the explosions you picture on Looney Tunes, but it is a process and well controlled and managed through the fire department locally as well. So
You get kid buy-in if it were though.
yeah,
You get tons of kid
they were so
buy-in.
disappointed when we did it at Ashland down the street. They were ready for the explosion. Like, that's it. Like, we had them all like out the window watching. It was like, boom. so disappointing little children. So that's why the Elmwood ones were orange, and then Hayden Row was yellow and green. And so the yellow one was the ones that was closer to those abutters on Hayden Row, and then deeper in the site was the step up, slightly lighter green.
Like this makes sense.
Okay, so jumping back up to sustainability and net zero. So sustainability, obviously the Admiral Code were negative because it was not optimal design and location. From a sustainability standpoint, Bob and his team are going to build a sustainable building that's thermally efficient. We looked at some of the solar orientations, and so that's why I think the bar was a slight knock, as Jarud had picked out earlier, about the orientation of the building that's not as desirable for that particular one. And then the Hayden Row, the ones that were in the east, we just knocked down a peg because you're actually clearing the forest a little deeper into the site, a little additional tree removal. So we're looking for, again, the relativeness of these options, and we're trying to find ways that they're actually a little bit different in the way they grade out. And so that was the main difference between the four at Hayden Row. The east was slightly less, but the building itself would be as sustainable in any option you pick at Hayden Row.
So we have yellow on the west and light green on the east.
For sustainable?
For sustainability?
Am I
No.
looking at the wrong one?
I went down 2 rows and then back
Okay.
up 2 rows.
Sorry
so-
about that.
We're here.
So yeah, so east is light green
Yeah,
and west
sorry.
are dark green.
Got it.
And part of the discussion also, as it relates to Elmwood, is that any of the new construction gives you a lot of flexibility in order to meet that sustainability. What the discussion about this revolved around is none of these are precluded from being sustainable, but when you view it in the confines of trying to define one versus the other, obviously the more trees that you have to take out in order to do it is a defining factor. On the Elmwood site, we also talked about solar orientation as it relates to the next topic of net zero, and it really becomes you're more affected on the net zero side with the bar scheme versus some of the other schemes in terms of solar orientation, but from an envelope standpoint and from an overall ability to achieve the town's sustainable goals, you're still able to accomplish a lot of the items that you're trying to meet. We did talk at length about, is the constraint site more affected in terms of how many geothermal wells you could put on the site, and ultimately arrived at that as not being a differentiating factor. You will struggle more on the Elmwood site to accomplish that as you encounter unforeseen conditions or other things that impact that, but it doesn't preclude you from meeting your objective of having the number of wells. And so ultimately we felt that consideration belonged in a different category than the sustainable or the net zero category for that reason.
Right, so specifically on that point, Dan could comment more on the wells, because they did a layout. The only place on the bar to put the wells, which we hit on earlier, was in that front parking lot, which is also what you need for parking and swing space and teacher parking and the kids to play and all that. And you need to build that first, so you can't build it on the ball fields that are in the existing building footprint. So we could have throttled this down, but we moved that negative down to swing space as opposed to here. And Dan, I don't know if you want to comment on the do each of the sites fit the well field? You guys did a layout.
Yeah, we laid them out. We laid out the well fields on all the sites, and they fit. There's multiple locations, with the exception of the Elm sites. I mean, on the village site, one we put it under the parking lot that's adjacent to the building. But you know, the rest of them, it's open and the fields will fit in those locations.
Right, their test fit showed it kind of dense, and then, you know, we know that we've got to lay out the water infiltration for the parking lot and all those other things, so it will get dispersed, and the point, I think, is that Hayden Row has more ability for the disbursement. You know, you'd have to work more complexly around the issues at Elmwood, but it's achievable, but they may have phasing premiums associated with that.
I think for geothermal, the cost might be a little bit lower at Elmwood because you have shallow bedrock, so you need less casing. So it may not be a big deal, but maybe a small difference.
No, an excellent point. You know, we hadn't really brought up to the committee, but yeah, to Giroud's point, you would put a metal casing at the top, you know, 25 feet or so of the well before you get down, you know, lower in bedrock. And if it is ledge, you don't need that casing.
Doesn't need as much.
So
But-
for me, it's hard to like separate the sustainability and the net zero, right? Because net zero is a form of sustainability. So like I'm having a really hard time with the.
Right, so the net zero kind of got broken off because a lot of people want to understand the operational costs of the building kind of long term, and so we kind of broke that out. You know, Bob and his team are going to design, you know, a LEED certifiable building. I don't know if you want to comment on any aspect of that. We've talked about it with Dan in a few meetings, that the buildings themselves will be sustainable from the standpoint of the building, and net zero is really a financial decision, and that's why we kind of broke them out separately. Because you may choose that you can't afford all of the geothermal. We may hear back from the design engineers that those federal rebates do or don't apply to a municipality, and you may decide how you pursue photovoltaics outside of the project, PPA, or purchase it, or so there are some different financial decision points there. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that or not, but okay. All right, so lastly, you know, before we revisit traffic, was swing space. Obviously, anything that needed a modular village was red, and so that was, you know, code Ed Reno and the village aspect. And then we put the bar red because of what we just discussed about the multi-use needs of the site and the phasing premiums associated with it.
And we, just for the community to understand, we did talk about sort of where do those costs for swing space come from. And so we looked at the size that Elmwood is now. We talked to the estimators about what they're seeing in the marketplace for swing space in terms of the fact that we'd likely need, based on space considerations, a 2-story swing space, which would be a temporary construction that would need to be constructed on site that's likely 2 stories to deal with the amount of space that's needed. We looked at a couple of different square footages to get an understanding where that fell, and looking at the size of Elmwood now, a more efficient layout, and what the estimators was telling us was potentially a $300 to $400 a square foot number. In order to get those modulars, we kept ending up around that $20 million number. We also went back and looked at the available information we had from what we did Marathon for Center School to understand whether it's a viable option to put that money into a town resource. And what we found is that Center School is about a 50,000 square foot building, which was less space than we would need to accommodate what's currently at Elmwood, which I think is 68 or 78.
78, I think.
So you're looking at something that's potentially 60 to 50% of the size of what you'd need to accommodate. So even if we went in and looked at that, we would still be looking at a significant amount of construction. We also looked at the base repair estimate that was done when the Elmwood, or when the Marathon project was done for Center Street, and we found it was about a $19 million cost estimated in 2015. So with escalation, you would be looking at a significant cost, probably more than what we were looking at for swing space, in order to upgrade that resource, and you would also continue to be too small.
It's been since shuttered, which triggers code upgrades to that building. So once you've stopped it for its intended use and stopped using it, you've now triggered more code upgrades than even the code upgrade envisioned.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful work, because I'm not sure anyone at this table would have envisioned Center School as a potentially viable option for swing space, but it is a question we'll get.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think I really appreciate the work that was done to do that analysis. So
Well, what was, I'm sorry, you just said it was about 50,000 square foot too small?
No,
That's
it's about a
the-
50,000 square foot building
yeah.
versus
Oh.
a 78,000 square foot Elmwood.
Okay, okay.
So there's a deficit there that you would have to deal with, whether it's, you can only move half the school, but you would still be looking at north of $20 million, probably well north of $20 million to get it to the level that you could accommodate that use.
Right.
And that ruled it out as an option.
Yep.
And to renovate, the short term, buying the modulars is faster than renovating the building. So if you renovate the building, you'd have the residual asset, but you'd have to add a lot more time to the overall get your modular school up and running component.
I'm guessing the answer is no, but are there any thoughts on those swing space delineations?
Unless the red can go darker.
Crimson.
Red.
So those are all of the categories that were new to cover tonight. In reopening the discussion on traffic, I think what we really wanted to focus on is based on what we heard from our traffic engineer tonight. Does anyone desire to make any changes to the way we've laid out the traffic categorizations there? Again, these are meant to obviously guide us in our discussions. These aren't like a score sheet that's going to get us to an answer. So, but yeah, I don't know if people feel like anything we learned tonight should adjust these.
I'd like to go back to the impact to neighbors
Sure.
item. For the Hayden Row site, I view the existing schools around it as neighbors. So I'm thinking, how do we capture the impact to current school operations around at that site, and vice versa too, the impact of school operations on construction. So would there be limitations on what times the trucks could go in and out? Whereas Elmwood is not the same kind of site, doesn't have schools around it, so where do we capture that? Or
Excellent points, right? So, kind of taking that in order, and others can chime in too. We can tweak or reshape criteria to whatever you guys think is how we want to define these guiding principles, because that's what they are. The schools themselves, certainly the traffic on Hayden Row has a thoroughfare, and so in a typical school, not on Hayden Row, let's say, we would have a limited blackout window for deliveries. We would say if the school opens at 8:30, 30 minutes before and after, don't do any deliveries there. It does get more complex at Hayden Row, which is a good point that you're raising, where we can't do a 3-hour blackout because you cascade the middle school to, Marathon to the new school there. So we would have to make it so that we can actually feed the job site with deliveries and work, and so we would need to be careful on how we put restrictions on the deliveries.
Yeah, one thing we did on the Marathon is most of the deliveries get to hop in on 495. And we made sure that the Marathon School, all the deliveries came off the Milford end. So they came down Hayden Road from the Milford end, as opposed to getting off down on West Main Street and coming through town and tying up everything. So that helped a lot, and all of them knew it from day one. And I don't think we had any issues.
Yeah, there's always the regular attendees are easier to control. So like your workforce, the contractors that show up. The deliveries are harder. We give the maps. They tell them where to come, but it's some guy. I just got told to deliver to here, and I put it in GPS, and so you'll get those.
We had the guys driving all night from Canada.
Right, exactly.
And you're going to have that.
But yeah, as much as we can, triage the traffic and have it come in the more advantageous route.
And I think morning traffic, as far as construction goes, school doesn't start till 9. Construction usually.
They start
I think
early, yeah.
Our town bylaws say we can start at 7.
7.
And that's typically when, from your business, that's typically when construction starts.
Yeah, most everybody wants to be there before the school starts.
Right. It'll be interesting, the release time, because I think it's usually 7 to 3 construction, right?
Right.
3 o'clock is our release time, so I think those are the things that we'd have to work out, is on the back half.
it may not be significant enough factor to change the coloring, but just wanted to bring it up.
That's a great point.
Good point. So with the traffic, I think the reason why I don't think it changes, because in my head it's still yellow, but we decided to leave it orange because it will require so much discussion and so much education, and so, you know, it's still a point of concern, even if the actual numbers say that it might be more of a yellowish thing. So I think that's why we decided to have it orange last time.
Well, and does it change now that we know does it change at Elmwood School now that we know that we're doing a 2 to 4? So if we went a 2 to 4 option at Elmwood School, we're adding we're adding the grade, so we're
That's an
adding
interesting point.
traffic
Yeah.
to that. So I don't know if it goes, any of these go to orange as well, you know?
That's a good point.
They probably do, actually. That's a
Yeah.
good point. You're adding another grade's worth of traffic to Elmwood.
I think you could put, you know, orange across you could plug any school name into the top of this thing.
Yeah.
That's the safest.
Right.
Traffic is neutral, but orange.
Right.
The problem is we're not starting from a place of neutral.
Well, I think I missed last week's discussion, but when we were talking about it internally, one of the things that came up repeatedly is that you're talking about it relative, and putting that much larger of a school over at Elmwood is not without traffic issues.
Right, that's what Leo was saying, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very challenging to look at it and say, well, I could make it yellow and that'd be okay, but the Hayden Row site will never, for the sake of the community, the Hayden Row site, nobody will ever look at it and say, gee, I wish this would get worse.
Well, that's exactly exactly what we said last week. Was we felt like we can't. One of the reasons we didn't make Hayden Row yellow is that no one would believe us.
Right.
Is so I think it's you know, but I do think that the consideration of making those two Elmwood 2 to 4 sites orange, when you are talking about adding that much volume as a dimension, I don't know that we considered last week. So I think that would be. I mean, I'd be in favor of that.
I'd be okay with that too. I think the other piece that he brought up this evening is that idea of queuing. And there's not as much queuing space. We know that on the Elmwood site under the bar plan or the village plan, because that site doesn't give us as much flow. But he said that it was going to be really important for traffic to be able to connect to campuses, to be able to get cars off of Hayden Row and queue them up off of Hayden Row, and have an exit that came off of Hayden Row. And we won't be able to connect a campus over there, and the queuing, like I said, isn't as available. So I think with an extra grade, it goes orange. Orange.
I think orange is the way to go too.
You talked about the fact that you decompressed some of the traffic at last week's meeting from Hayden Row too, but you're adding that cross traffic. So, you know, that in itself has two different effects that kind of compete with themselves too. And so that's another consideration when you color it.
So just so that I'm not updating it live on the screen for those who are watching from home, but is that the ultimate decision that will go to orange with the 2 to 4 schemes for Elmwood?
I think orange across the board pretty much, just
Yeah, if there are no objections, I think we can.
except for the one we're not really talking about, which is the renovation.
Yeah, the ad reno can stay yellow,
Can't
which is
even
not
put
a
it
viable option because
Right.
it doesn't fit the kids.
Right, we'll just add that to the notes as to why.
I do just want to make sure. So, any of our Zoom participants, any feedback that we haven't captured on the matrix, probably haven't been as dutiful in checking in, especially with you. So I just want to make sure I give that opportunity.
I do have one more question. Under the educational programming and accommodation, the Elmwood Village site, I know the village on the Hayden Row site is 2 longer hallways, and so we said that wasn't most advantageous, but on the Elmwood site, the village setup is actually 3 shorter wings, like the pinwheel. So I'm just curious, should that be a darker green as well? Because it does have the 3 shorter. I guess the only thing there was the gym and the cafeteria are adjacent.
That's right.
Is that
that's
why
right.
it's a lighter green?
Right.
Okay. but it does have 2 courtyards versus 1 courtyard. I didn't know.
The other factor that we didn't talk about along educational program accommodation is that it's both how the scheme itself accommodates the program and also how the site accommodates the program. So you end up with, one of the things we talked about is that in the village versus the bar scheme, you're forced to push the fields further from the building because of the gas easement. And so that factors into whether or not you can accomplish all of your outdoor recreation and learning goals on that site as efficiently as you can in the other schemes.
Carol, I saw you came off mute. Did you have something? No, you're good?
All set, thank you. I just didn't know if you were gonna ask if we had questions, and I was gonna say, no, I don't. So I'm
Okay,
good.
great.
Did I miss any other color changes while I was trying to do the minutes during the sustainable construction to neighbors? I think I captured them all. I don't think we changed any other colors.
Elmwood Village cost was to go to red.
Okay. Then I think that's wraps up the criteria discussion, the evaluation matrix, correct?
Yes.
I believe so, yes.
So obviously, when we talk about the next item on the agenda is discuss upcoming meetings, and I'll probably just discuss one upcoming meeting, which is next week. So, yeah.
We came prepared.
We only care about one of them right now, because the other ones require this one. So obviously next week, the primary agenda item is going to be for us to deliberate and decide on our preferred option from these designs. The matrix that we've all been looking at a lot for the past 2 weeks, again, is designed to be both a guideline for us in terms of evaluating the different criteria, and also, as much as anything, a historical record to show how we did this analysis. So I want to make sure that people, view it as more of a qualitative document than a scorecard. I did want to just test, so we have a number of options to look through. As I was thinking about it coming into tonight, from a process perspective, what I thought made the most sense to guide the discussion, and I wanted to see if people were amenable to this, is I think first and foremost, we start with the sites. Right? We have 2 sites that we're looking at, and I think we can reasonably decide which of the 2 sites are better. And then in that way, we can then focus in on whichever site we choose. If it's the Elmwood site, we have 2 options to consider. If it's the Marathon site, then we probably then go to the locations on the Marathon site and then the layouts of the buildings. So I think if we progress that way, that will probably be the most efficient way for us to get there. So if that's okay with everybody, that's what we'll plan to do next week. Okay. And so again, it's going to be deliberation, so we'll have time to go further into those criteria, any questions we come up with, anything we think of, and then we'll be tracking towards a vote.
One question for the school committee vote. What is the plan in terms of what information is going to be handed to the school committee? Is it just like our option recommendation, or are we going to have all the kind of justification, so if there's questions?
I think the plan would be that we would obviously give the school committee the evaluation criteria matrix so that they could see that how we arrived there. We do a short presentation that explains the process and maybe highlights a couple of the particular criteria that were discussed the most the most throughout the process, and then open up for questions.
Okay, I would definitely recommend that we have the traffic information, because once again, school committee, it's gonna come up, and it would be nice to rehash it in a different forum as well.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that presentation will have a pretty large appendix, so that if there are any questions that require us to be able to drill down a little further, we'll be prepared to do that.
Okay.
But that's a good call up, because, and I said I was only going to talk about one meeting, but it's a great point. Those meetings come up on each other really quickly. So once we actually make a decision as a vote, as a committee, we're gonna have to turn around pretty quickly to get ready for a Thursday school committee meeting. I will also point out that the 2/21 ESBC meeting is not happening unless something changes, so everyone can enjoy their February vacation. And so, yeah, so we would, the next ESBC meeting after next week won't be until March 1st.
And not to gloss over it, we'll also be taking the option that is selected by the school committee and the ESBC to the select board on the 28th, just for the public.
Okay. All right. Any other business or questions that people have? Then I would seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, motion by Mike. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, second by Jagroot, and I just need to confirm, Bill is still with us, so we need to do a roll call vote. So Jagroot,
Yes.
Tiffany,
Yes.
Leah,
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Mike's a yes. I'm not skipping Jen this time. We only have one voting school committee member. I'm just gonna keep pointing that out every time. Bill?
Yes.
Bill's a yes, and I'm a yes, so it is unanimous, and we are adjourned at 8:12. Thank you to HCAM for broadcasting. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.